And you have to go back even earlier for this excerpt, which takes place in 1968. You remember 1968? The current season of Mad Men? Okay. 10 years old, I hung out with the Pollock boys. Will was my age. John and Chris were twins a year younger. But Chris seemed like he was younger still. Mama's boy, his brothers called him, and Little Snitch. During the week, it was just the boys with their mom. I remember her turned to the stove, apron strings tied together and hung down the back of her skirt. The kind of below-the-knee skirt girls wore back in Gidget movies. Pushing a vacuum cleaner down the long hallway, on her hands and knees scrubbing the kitchen floor. She didn't have much of a say over the boys. She wasn't someone you actually talked to. Mr. Pollock used to be some kind of military man. He still had his military hair, and the boys all had crew cuts. He smoked all the time and he talked loud. His voice sounded like it went through some kind of grinding machine before it left his throat. Mr. Pollock had a large paddle with holes in it. He used to spank his boys, which he did every Saturday night before the whole family drove off to church in the morning. He whacked them to build up their character. That's how Will told it to me. The boys lined up to wait their turn in Mr. Pollock's library, a little room with built-in shelves filled with books on history and politics and philosophy. The Pollock boys had their military dad, but it was me who introduced them to the idea of a secret fort. We had a secret fort and a loose stand of bamboo between two houses where we saw our neighbors walk around naked. We had a secret fort in a storm drain, shimmying through the narrow little opening at the end of the block. We watched the cars go by and people across the street who had no idea we were spying on them. The best secret fort was the shed that butted up to the back of the liquor store. No one used the shed anymore, but all kinds of stuff had been dumped there. Old toilets, sawed-off pieces of 2x4, rolls of linoleum. The walls were made of odd pieces of plywood, and the inside of the walls were covered with pictures from Playboy magazines. Lots of big pink titties, the Pollock boys liked to say. We did all the things you do in a secret fort: comic books, soldiers, go fish. We left Chris at home the day we played with fire. His brothers really hated the Little Snitch. 10 years old, you don't really think what you'll do once a chunk of 2x4 catches on fire. We couldn't put it out, and it spread to the wooden bench. I crawled out the narrow opening and ran after Will and John, and in a couple of minutes we heard sirens. By the time we walked back around the block, there was a crowd of people watching the firemen hose down the collapsed shed, and they pulled out all the blackened old toilets, and everything was just a pile of trash. John told his twin brother Chris about the fire, because that's the kind of thing you can't keep to yourself. Chris told his mom, and she waited for Mr. Pollock to get back from his club. Will ran over to my house and climbed up the back stairs and went past my bedroom window, and he told me what the Little Snitch had done. It was a couple of hours before Mr. Pollock rang our doorbell. I can't say exactly what I did in those 2 hours. Sat at my desk, lay down on my bed, tried to figure out if I could get away, go to the park, somewhere they couldn't find me. Our doorbell was the kind that buzzes as long as you hold your finger on it, and it buzzed twice, quick and short. I heard Annie's footsteps fast through the dining room. She opened the front door. I opened my own door and looked down to where I could see her, the back of her head, tangled black hair, old blue dress she wore every day in the summer. Annie spoke quiet. "Hi, Mr. Pollock." She held the door at an angle, and I couldn't see the way he looked down at her, if he held his arms across his chest, or made fists he pressed into his hips. But I knew he stood right there on the threshold, wearing the same clothes he wore every Saturday, his brown slacks and checkered sport coat and black tie and white shirt, his solid, squat body, and his feet that turned outward in their black work shoes. I knew he looked at Annie. He didn't care if she was just a little girl. The scratched-up way Mr. Pollock spoke. "Get your father, girl." Annie ran right past me, down the hall and down the stairs to the basement, where Dad watched the Channel 2 news. He didn't interrupt Dad during the news, no matter if it was Jerry Dunphy or Walter Cronkite or whoever was the weekend anchor. Annie ran back up the stairs, top speed and back to the breakfast room. I closed my door and backed away, felt Dad through the floor. And when he passed my room, I opened the door again just wide enough to watch. Dad from behind, skinny waist that flared up to his big shoulders, his undershirt with a circle of sweat. Different from Mr. Pollock, tall, and he stood like a dancer. That was my dad, someone that used to swing girls around on the end of his arm. Richard, Dad said. Richard Pollock. Without being able to see him, I knew it wasn't arms folded across the chest, but fists on the hips. It was blue eyes and shaved head and broken nose. And he stared at my dad's throat, because Dick Pollock wouldn't tilt his head back to look up at anyone. You're goddamn kite, kid. Hold on a minute, Richard, Dad said. His arms down at his waist and then where I couldn't see. Palms up, I thought. This was what it was like every time they talked. Dick Pollock mad about something and my dad all weak-ass trying to calm him down. At the Labor Day picnic, Mr. Pollock said Martin Luther King had it coming. That when Nixon was in the White House, we'd see some law and order back in the country. That even the Jews that ran the New York Times couldn't get Humphrey elected. Dad held up his hands and said, Richard, let's just stay away from politics and religion, okay? I think Mr. Pollock said things just to see if he could get Dad pissed off, but all he ever got was cliches and weak-ass phrases. Your goddamn kid started that fire down there behind the liquor store. Almost killed 2 of my boys. Richard, I don't know what you're talking about. Weak-ass. Placating. Don't you know how to raise your kids? You keep them away from my Christian boys. You understand? You keep your goddamn kite kid away. I didn't know the word kite, but it sounded like cunt, and it sounded like fuck. So I knew it was bad. The way Dad's shoulders went up in the back, the way he shut the door so quiet, that the latch fell into place with a hard click. He backed away from the door a couple of steps before he turned. I shut my own door, stood in the middle of the room. Nothing was safe in there. I could feel him walk down the hall. He opened the door, his high forehead wet with sweat. He was in the doorway and then he was right in front of me. His hands on my shoulders, fingers hard right near my neck, and thumbs pushed into my collarbones, pressure points. And I tried to squeeze away from him, tried to shrink away, but he held tight. I couldn't help it but let out a sound. Dad's throat right there. I looked at the same thing Mr. Pollock must have looked at. Little black hairs that needed a shave, sweat and pores and Adam's apple. His nostrils flared open, his wide eyes, his cheeks, all the blood that rushed somewhere else. His spit hit me as he yelled. Are you stupid, he said, are you goddamn stupid? He squeezed his hands tighter, his breath, cigarettes, the alcohol from the drink he took to watch the news. I saw his hatred. That's all I could figure out, hatred. But it was humiliation and helplessness and weakness. It was Dick Pollock laying it into Dad like he was swinging his paddle into one of his own kids' asses. He breathed through his nose loud and louder, and one hand came off my shoulder, and he squeezed the hand tight into a fist, and he swung the fist into me, into my stomach, and I fell to the floor, all my air gone. I never lost my air before, never had the wind knocked out of me. I thought right then I would die. My stomach hurt from the punch, but all I could think was, I couldn't breathe. My sight went red, and then black spots, and then blackness, and if I could see after that, I don't remember. My knees pulled up to my chest, made myself small, but it was too late. I couldn't see, but I could hear. Dad walked out of the room. Each step hit the carpet, pushed on the floor underneath, radiated out from where he stepped. Each step into my ear all the way to his bedroom. Still couldn't catch a breath, couldn't think straight, couldn't figure out how to move. Dad's voice from his bedroom, like the footsteps that went through the floor, but his words went through the air. I knew the words, but I didn't know them. They didn't make sense. Michael needs you. Mom's footsteps in the hall and then in my room, and I took in the smallest little breath, saw a little light. Mom's feet in white socks, her blue slacks, the ruffle of her movement as she kneeled down. I could see again, colors blurry through tears. Mom's pullover sweatshirt, her plastic framed glasses that took up half her face, her short gray hair. She put a hand on my back, her head right near mine, her chest on my shoulder. I breathed a second time, a third time, smelled Mom's cigarettes. It was in her hair. It was the smell when she held me close after kids chased me home from school, or when she told me stories to help me fall asleep. Helen of Troy, Hamlet. My breath was back. Mom's hip pressed against me. She wheezed when she spoke. She was scared for you, she said. She talked slow, not the way she talked about Greek myths and Shakespeare, not the way she laughed when she said, "Get thee to a nunnery." He gets so scared and he doesn't know what to do, she said. She was heavy against me, smoky hair close to my face. He loves you, but he doesn't know how to say it, and he was so scared that he just lost control of himself, she said. That's what she said, but it sounded like she said something else. There was a bigger story, but she didn't know how to start. It took a long time to figure it out. Dad was scared, but he wasn't scared for me. He was scared of Mr. Pollock, and he was scared of the world where people are tough and they fight, and Dad's job and his money won't help. It rose up in him, his helplessness in the world of men. There I was, same height as Mr. Pollock, 5.5 feet tall, but just a skinny kid. I was Dad's kite kid, and I was as helpless as he was.